It is the summer of 1346. A lookout on the walls of Calais spots a vast army marching across the horizon. The English king, Edward III, has arrived with one goal: to starve the city into submission. Calais would hold out for nearly a year, but not every city could last that long. Some fell in weeks, others surrendered in days. The question is, what made the difference? To understand how long a siege could last, we must first look at the city. The walls of a city were its first and most obvious defense. High stone walls, thick enough to withstand catapult stones, made direct assault costly. But walls alone were not enough. A city also needed a reliable source of water inside the walls. Without a well or a river, the defenders would be forced to surrender within days. Food was the second critical factor. A city that had stocked its granaries before the siege could last months. But if the harvest had been poor or the city was caught by surprise, the defenders would soon face starvation. In many sieges, the attackers simply waited for hunger to do its work, while the defenders ate their horses, then their pets, and finally the leather from their own shoes. But perhaps the most decisive factor was the morale of the defenders. A united city with strong leadership could endure incredible hardship. A divided city, where nobles quarreled with merchants or the poor resented the rich, would crumble from within. In the end, a siege was not just a test of walls and food, but it was easy. A besieging army had to feed itself too. Foraging parties would strip the countryside for miles around. If the siege dragged on into winter, the attackers could starve or freeze. Disease spread quickly in crowded camps. Dysentery, typhus, and plague could wipe out an army faster than any battle. So both sides raced against time and hunger. Inside the city, the defenders faced their own crisis. Food was rationed from the start. The lord or mayor would seize all grain and livestock, then distribute small daily portions. Bread became a luxury. People ate horses, dogs, rats, and even leather boiled in water. Starvation weakened everyone. Children and the elderly died first. The smell of death filled the streets. Water was another weapon. Attackers would dam or poison rivers and wells upstream. Inside the walls, wells could run dry or become contaminated. Without clean water, sanitation collapsed. Sewage piled up in the streets. Rats and flies multiplied. Disease spread faster than the defenders could bury the dead. A city could fall not to the enemy's sword, but to its own filth. Yet some cities held out for years. The key was preparation. A well-stocked city with strong walls, multiple wells, and disciplined leadership could outlast any blockade. The defenders would repair breaches at night, build new walls behind the old ones, and even launch counterattacks. They knew that surrender meant massacre or slavery, so they endured. Easy? A city's survival depended on preparation, geography, and luck. Before the siege began, a prudent city would stockpile food, repair walls, and secure its water supply. But many cities were caught off guard. In 1204, the French city of Château Gaillard fell in just a few months because the defenders hadn't stored enough food. The attacker, King Philip II, simply waited. But even the best preparations had limits. A city of 10,000 people could consume a ton of grain per day. A typical medieval siege might last months, sometimes years. The city of Antioch held out for 8 months during the First Crusade, but only because the Crusaders themselves ran out of food first. In the end, the city fell to betrayal, not starvation. But starvation was the most common weapon. The Assyrians, the Romans, the Mongols all used hunger to break cities, and the defenders knew it. They would sometimes expel the old, the sick, and the poor from the city to save food for the fighters. It was a brutal calculus, but sometimes even that wasn't enough. Consider the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The Roman general Titus surrounded the city during Passover when it was packed with pilgrims. Food supplies ran out quickly. The historian Josephus describes people eating leather, grass, and even each other. The famine became so severe that a woman named Mary, driven mad by hunger, killed and cooked her own infant. When the Romans finally breached the walls, they found a city of skeletons. The population had been reduced from perhaps 600,000 to almost nothing. But starvation wasn't always one-sided. Sometimes the besiegers suffered more than the besieged. During the Siege of Paris in 880–5886 by the Vikings, the Frankish defenders held out for months while the Vikings ran out of food themselves. The Vikings had to eat their horses and eventually retreated. The city survived because its walls were strong, its people were determined, and its attackers were hungry. So the next time you see a medieval castle, remember, Its real strength wasn't the 10,000 people needed about 10 tons of grain per day. Multiply that by months and the numbers become staggering. Sieges were not just military events. They were human tragedies. Inside the walls, civilians faced hunger, disease, and despair. In 1347, during the Siege of Calais, the city's population was reduced to eating horses, dogs, and even rats. The chronicler Jean Froissart wrote that they had nothing to eat but misery. When food ran, some turned to cannibalism. In the Great Famine of 1315–1317, chroniclers reported parents eating their own children. These were not monsters. They were ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Starvation breaks the strongest bonds of society. Disease was an even deadlier enemy. Crowded, unsanitary conditions inside besieged cities bred epidemics. Typhus, dysentery, and the plague swept through populations already weakened by hunger. During the Siege of Antioch in 1098, the Crusader army was decimated by disease before they even faced the enemy. More soldiers died from sickness than from combat. The psychological toll was immense. Chroniclers described the siege madness that gripped defenders, hallucinations, despair, and irrational violence. In 1453, during the final siege of Constantinople, defenders reported seeing strange lights in the sky, which they interpreted as divine omens. The mind, like the body, could only endure so much. The weakest died first, the elderly, the sick, and the young. Some cities expelled the useless mouths to save supplies, forcing them to wander between the lines. But hunger was not the only killer. Water, or the lack of it, could bring a city to its knees faster than any army. A person can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. In a siege, the water supply was often the first target. Attackers would poison wells, dam rivers, or divert streams away from the city. Inside, the defenders rationed every drop. Cisterns and reservoirs were guarded like treasure. But as the siege dragged on, the water turned foul. Disease spread. Dysentery and cholera killed more people than arrows or siege engines ever could. The stench of death hung over the streets, and still the enemy waited outside. Some cities tried to break the siege by sallying out, a desperate attack on the enemy camp. But these sorties were costly. Men died in droves, and if they failed, the city's defenses weakened further. Others sent messengers through secret tunnels, begging for relief armies that might never come. Hope became a scarce commodity. And as supplies ran out, the unthinkable began to happen. People started eating things they boiled leather, ate rats, and ground bones into flour. Dogs and cats vanished from the streets. In the worst cases, the dead were not buried, they were eaten. Cannibalism, the ultimate taboo, became a grim reality. Chroniclers wrote of mothers eating their own children, though such accounts may be propaganda. But one thing is certain. When a city fell, it was often not because the walls were breached, but because the people inside had nothing left, would divert rivers, poison wells, or cut off aqueducts. In 1191, during the Siege of Acre, the Muslim defenders destroyed the city's water source, forcing the Crusaders to rely on rainwater. Cities with access to a river or a spring inside the walls had a huge advantage. Those without could not last more than a few days without rain. In 1453, Constantinople fell partly because the Ottomans controlled the water supply. The defenders had to ration every drop. The city's famous aqueducts built by the Romans were no longer functional. The Ottomans had blocked the main supply lines. Without water, the morale of the defenders collapsed. They could not fight, they could not extinguish fires, and disease spread. The Ottomans eventually breached the walls, and the city fell. Control of water had decided the fate of an empire. Had to ration water, and morale collapsed. Historians have analyzed siege durations across medieval Europe. The average siege lasted about 6 to 8 months, but the range was enormous, from a few days to over a decade. The longest sieges were those where the defender had ample supplies and the attacker lacked the resources to maintain a blockade. The Siege of Candia lasted 21 years, from 1648 to 1669. But rare, most sieges ended within a year. The key factors were food, water, and the will to fight. A well-stocked fortress could hold out for months, but disease often did more damage than enemy action. Dysentery and typhus spread quickly in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Siege camps also suffered from outbreaks. The attacker's camp could become a death trap if supply lines were cut. So the siege became a race. Siege engines evolved to break walls faster. The trebuchet, a massive counterweight catapult, could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds. It was more accurate and powerful than earlier torsion catapults. Engineers built them on site, sometimes taking weeks to assemble. The largest trebuchets could breach walls in days, but defenders adapted. They thickened walls, added moats, and built bastions that allowed crossfire. The art of siege warfare became a constant back and forth between attack and defense. The exception, not the rule. Most sieges were decided by starvation, disease, or betrayal. A traitor opening a gate could end a siege in minutes, or a relief army arriving could force the attackers to lift the siege. The siege of a city was a complex operation involving thousands of men, vast amounts of supplies, and constant engineering work. It was a test of logistics as much as courage, and in the end, the outcome often depended on who could endure the long. Most sieges ended within a year. The attacker's army also needed food, and foraging parties could only scour the countryside so far. The key variable was the ratio of defenders to supplies. A city with 1,000 defenders and food for 6 months could last longer than a city with 10,000 defenders and food for 2 months. As the siege dragged on, disease became a silent ally of the attacker. Crowded, unsanitary conditions inside the city led to outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and plague. The defenders' morale crumbled as they watched their comrades die not from enemy arrows, but from invisible enemies. Meanwhile, the attacker could rotate fresh troops and bring in new supplies from home. Time was a weapon that cut both ways, but it usually favored the side with better logistics. The most famous example of a siege that defied the odds was the Siege of Malta in 1565. A small force of Knights Hospitaller, around 500 knights and a few thousand soldiers, held out against an Ottoman army of over 40,000 men for nearly 4 months. The defenders used every advantage: strong fortifications, artillery, and the brutal summer heat that slowed the Ottomans. They also received reinforcements by sea. The siege finally ended when the Ottomans, exhausted and low on supplies, withdrew. Malta became a legend. It proved that a determined defender with good logistics and strong walls could hold out against overwhelming numbers. But for every Malta, there were 100 sieges that ended in slaughter or surrender. The lesson was clear. In siege warfare, the best strategy was to avoid being besieged in the first. Inside the walls bred typhus, dysentery, and plague. In 1428, during the Siege of Orleans, the English were struck by disease in their own camp, weakening their blockade. The French defenders, led by Joan of Arc, broke the siege. Disease could also devastate the defenders. In 1348, the Black Death swept through Europe, and many sieges were abandoned as both sides succumbed. Sometimes the attacker didn't need to storm the walls. They could simply wait for starvation or disease to do the work. A well-placed blockade could cut off all supplies, turning a fortress into a prison. Starvation was a silent weapon. Without food, the defenders grew weak and surrender became the only option. The besiegers just had to wait, simply wait for disease to do the work. But waiting was expensive. Not all sieges ended by starvation or assault. Many ended because someone inside opened the gates. Betrayal was a constant. In 1204, the city of Constantinople was betrayed by a disgruntled noble who let the Crusaders in. The city fell in a single day. The threat of betrayal forced defenders to watch their own citizens. Suspicion could tear a city apart from within. Suspicion could tear a city apart from within, making the siege a battle of minds as much as of swords. Sometimes the attacker would offer generous terms: surrender now and live, refuse and face slaughter. That choice could split a city's leadership. So how long could a medieval city survive a siege? The honest answer: it depends. But we can make a rough estimate based on the factors we've discussed. A well-prepared city with ample food, a secure water source, and a united population could last a year or more. The Siege of Candia lasted 21 years, while the Siege of Constantinople in 1453 lasted just 53 days. The difference was not just supplies. It was also the attacker's determination. The Ottomans were willing to pay any price to take Constantinople. They brought an army of over 100,000 men, a fleet of ships, and the largest cannon the world had ever seen. Their determination was absolute. The defenders of Constantinople were outnumbered and exhausted. They had held out for weeks, but the walls were crumbling under the constant bombardment. The end was near. On the morning of May 29, 1453, the Ottomans launched their final assault. Wave after wave of soldiers poured through the breaches. The Byzantine Empire fell that day, to lose thousands of men to take Constantinople. Edward III was patient enough to wait at Calais. In the end, a siege was a battle of wills. The city's survival depended on how long its people could endure hunger, thirst, disease, and fear. Medieval sieges teach us about human resilience and the limits of endurance. They also remind us that history is not a simple story of heroes and villains. The next time you see a castle or a fortified city, remember the stories of those who lived through a siege. Their endurance shaped the world we live in today. History is not just about kings and battles. It is about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Their resilience is a lesson for all of us. A medieval castle's walls were not just stone. They were the hopes and fears of the people inside. When you hear about a siege that lasted a year, think about the 10 tons of grain needed each day, the wells that ran dry, and the families that huddled together in the dark. The medieval city was a fragile ecosystem. Break one link, food, water, morale, and the whole system collapsed. Siege engineers knew this. They aimed not just at walls, but at the city's ability to. Defenders used every advantage. They poured boiling oil from the battlements, fired arrows through narrow slits, and dug countermines to collapse enemy tunnels. But hunger was the hardest enemy. Rats, leather, even sawdust became food. When the siege finally ended, the survivors emerged changed. The city walls still stood, but the people inside had been reshaped by hardship. The medieval city was never just stone. It was the people who lived and died within its shadow. The first thing an attacker needed was a plan. Siege warfare was not a blunt instrument. It was a science. Engineers studied the walls, looking for weak points. They dug tunnels, built towers, and aimed catapults with careful calculation. Every move was a gamble against time but the defenders were not idle. They repaired breaches at night, poured boiling oil on ladders, and fired arrows from every battlement. Inside the walls, the city became a fortress of its own. Every citizen had a role, carrying water, tending the wounded, or simply. Time was the true enemy. Food and water ran low, disease spread in cramped quarters, hope faded with each passing week. Yet some cities held out for months, even years. Their secret was preparation, stockpiled grain, deep wells, and a population that refused to surrender. In the end, a siege was a battle of wills. The attacker had to keep his army fed and motivated. The defender had to keep his people alive and hopeful. When one side broke, the city fell. But when both held, the siege could last until the walls themselves became legend.